Again to the final day of the Jaipur Literature Festival 2023 at Bank of Baroda, Charbagh. We're delighted to introduce the session, The Road to the Country, in the words of Chigozie Obioma. Chigozie Obioma's insights into Nigerian culture, languages, conflicts, and tenuous resolutions have presented multiple dimensions to an ancient land taken over by brutal colonialism. His prize-winning novels, The Fisherman and An Orchestra of Minorities, reflect the sociocultural realities of his country, even as the people strive to build a free nation in the midst of divisiveness and differences. His essay, Pride and Punishment, is a compelling statement on the beauty and complexity of Nigerian heritage. In conversation with Manasi Subramaniam, editor-in-chief at Penguin Random House, India, Obioma discusses his upcoming book and the narratives that have formed his writing life. I'm delighted to welcome Obioma and Manasi onto the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, give them a big hand of applause.
Thank you, Rajat. So this thing almost fell in my... Okay.
Chigozie Obioma was born in Akure, Nigeria. His two novels, The Fisherman 2015 and An Orchestra of Minorities 2019, were finalists for the Booker Prize and have been translated into more than 31 languages. They have won awards including the LA Times Book Award and International Literarturpris, and have also been nominated for more than 24 others. He lives between Nigeria and the USA. Manasi Subramaniam is editor-in-chief at Penguin Random House, India, where she leads the literary division's flagship imprints. She has published some of the most exciting new voices across South Asia, including winners of the Booker and Pulitzer Prizes, among others. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is over to you, Manasi and Obioma. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
Hello, and thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us. I am so happy to be in conversation with Chigozie about his books. Chigozie has the truly distinguished pleasure and privilege of being a writer who, both of whose novels have been shortlisted for the Booker. They've been finalists for some of the biggest awards in the world. They've won so many awards. And honestly, Chigozie, is there anything you write that doesn't immediately get shortlisted for something? Did you write a grocery list this morning that has been shortlisted for the Booker?
I don't know about that.
What an absolutely extraordinary honor. I know I want to talk to you a lot about your life and your work, but since it's your books that have brought you here, I think it would be lovely to start with a reading. So would you like to read to us a little bit from An Orchestra of Minorities?
Okay. Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be in Jaipur. I've been saying to a lot of people that the cosmos had tried to stop me from coming here. 2019, I was supposed to be here. It didn't work out. 2020, the pandemic stopped me. Then last year, Putin stopped me. And then, finally, in fact, I missed my first section, because my flights were canceled. So I am absolutely delighted to be here and to be speaking with Manasi, who is, in my opinion, one of the top editors in the world. So thank you. So I would read quickly from An Orchestra of Minorities, which is a novel that is narrated by a spirit. So if you can pronounce my name, you already know that it begins with Chi. So that Chi actually is a kind of a spirit. The Igbo people believe that everybody has a logos in them, and that is a kind of divinity that ensouls every individual, and that is the chi. So in this novel, it is a reincarnating spirit that has lived for some 700 years and tells the story of this singular story of a poultry farmer in 2000s Nigeria. He walked on for what must have been an hour more with the strides of a slightly drunk, until he arrived at an alley of houses. The longing to reach the city was in his mind like the thirst for water in the desert. He wanted to reach there and find the nearest bus station where he could wait to be picked up. And presently he sauntered into the half-closed mouth of a street which wound down inwards, away from the long main road as even fear. And it seemed to be a poor neighborhood, for the houses were low-roofed and old, their facades strewn with flower-bearing plants firmed to the clay-colored earth. An uprooted gate leaned against a wall in front of one of the houses, and a man stood on a ladder stretched against the walls, nailing something into it. Across on the other side of the road, overlooking a bridge, was a deep crater that stretched for kilometers on end, the earth rising in sinuous rows towards what seemed to be a developed part of the city. He followed the trail, tired, half mad, walking against the wheel of his heart past houses that sat like shadows in the sun, and the sweat-soaked fabric he wore sticking to his skin. He heard itinerant voices of people he could not see, and birds he'd never seen before plunged across the plains and sailed at an unhurried pace. Ebunu, as soon as he advanced around the bend where the road turned back right towards the main one, he was jolted by a shout and the sound of rushing feet behind him, followed closely by the sound of approaching voices. He turned, and a group of children, having burst out of the gate of some compound, had mobbed him. For he saw now the small gate swinging, and these children running towards him, shouting, "Abi, Abi," and then, "Ronaldinho, Ronaldinho." Chuku. In the moment between the closing of an eye and its reopening, he was in the midst of a thronging mob, full of noise and push, and was speaking in unfamiliar language, and a hand tugged at his spotted shirt from behind him, and before he could turn in that direction, another pulled at his hem. Someone shouted something in his ear, and before he could make sense of what had been said to him, he was submerged in a well of words. He stamped his feet on the ground, waved his arm, about to free himself from the grabbing hands, and in the dim reprieve, he realized that he was ticketed in a mob of curious boys. The recognition shocked him, and in an instant he yelled that they desist. He clutched his bag with one hand and raised the other hand and swung himself from a grip and staggered, and the boys behind him stepped back from him like scared flies. He clenched his teeth, raised his hand and landed it on the first head he could reach. He stepped back again as quickly as he could, and in a moment he was free. The children, what are they? From whence had they come? Could they not see that he bore no resemblance around Ronaldinho? Did they not know that also that Ronaldinho could not possibly be here, like him, eviscerated, a walking shell of what he had once been before? One of the children stepped back forward and motioned to the others to back off. He was dressed in shorts and a singlet, taller than the rest of the boys. This boy carrying something started saying something and gestured to a small boy who was carrying a ball. Then he demonstrated that he wanted Chinonso to sign it. Another brought a pen and a book. They all gestured, and it became clear to him that their hectoring would cease immediately if he heeded their request.
Thank you. Thank you. That was truly, truly beautiful. And I have to ask, what were your literary influences when you first began to write? Who are the writers who have shaped the writing of something quite as spectacular as this?
So I would say that I came to writing by serendipity. I wanted something that was more vocational and that could make me very wealthy. So I wanted to be a footballer. I had grown up watching Diego Maradona and all of those guys, and that was what I wanted to do. But there was a sequence of events that led to me spending some time at the hospital as a little boy. And I was already in school. I knew about stories and books and all of that, but they didn't have that gravity until during this spell of time, when I would lie in bed, and then my dad or my mom would tell me stories, and I would close my eyes, and it became for me, all of a sudden, stories meant something different. It was like a major transformative epiphany. And I realized that there was this thing called the landscape of the imagination that seemed to open up. So my dad, for instance, we conjure up this image, through stories, and I would realize them in my mind. And, it just changed me. I began to think, okay, wow, so I could think of an entire life of an individual, and it would be unique to my mind. No one other person has access to that until I put it on page. So that was how I became a writer. And then, I began to crave for books. And it so happened that, my dad had a library, a small library. Yeah. So he was a Shakespeare guy, So I grew up reading most of that. There were some African writers there. Amos Tutuola, for instance, he had a copy of which was the first real book that I read, the Palm Wine Drinkard. So I read everything there as well. Chinua Achebe, So I actually grew up on classical Greek and Shakespearean, tragedies and work. So in some ways, I feel like those have shaped what I write, because people often slam tragedies on some of my work. Whether or not it's true, I don't know. But yes, in some ways, yes, I was shaped by the early readings or exposure, I would say.
So one question: do you still play football?
I try to, yes. I don't know that I would be on any team now, but I used to do that. I mean, sometimes I still do pick up what the Americans call pick up football, here and there, yes.
And I love how you gravitated towards a life in writing, thinking that it was not going to bring you fame, and yet here we are, one of the most famous living writers on the planet right now. What does fame do to you as a writer?
I don't know if I'm famous, but I would say that the one thing I always wanted to do, so two things. A few years ago, I went back home to Nigeria, and not just in Nigeria, but where I grew up, Akure, and most of my friends had left. Nigeria keeps sinking, and so many of them are living in different countries. But I met about two of them who were in primary school with me, and I realized something that I hadn't thought about for a long time. While growing up, there was this generic question that you will be asked: what is your future ambition? And everybody will raise their hands, and the whole hall will be filled of doctor, pilot, engineer, this and that. And I used to be the renegade. I would be the last one, novelist, and everybody will laugh at me. Oh, this guy wants to, so that, but that was the thing that I would always say. And 20-something years on, I'm looking at my friends, we're discussing all of these things, and not a single one of them has become what they wanted to be back then. They've derailed. I mean, some of them are successful, but the guy who said he wanted to be a doctor back then is a businessman now. The one who said he wanted to be a pilot, now it's like, you know, maybe a driver or something. But I've kind of managed to do what I always wanted to do. So I see that in some ways as, you know, an achievement in itself, that, you know, this dream I had has been realized. So I care very much about that. And also, you know, I used to say that I used to dream that someday people will read my work. That still remains the same. I don't really care. I don't think I'm interested on myself. Maybe my new shirt is or something, but Chigozie Obioma himself is not an interesting guy. But, you know, so the books that I write, the stories that I tell, my ideas is what I want to be in the world and to be appreciated. To some extent, that has been the case. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, you will have to allow me the privilege of disagreeing with you when you say you're not an interesting guy. But we spoke a little bit about some of your influences, and you mentioned Shakespeare and you mentioned the Greek tragedies, and we definitely see that in your writing. There's like a prophecy, a Macbeth-style prophecy almost in your first book. There's a lot of Homer, I think, in your second book, and like these influences are so clearly so important to you as a writer. And I'm a Shakespearean myself, and like I completely understand the fascination that we have with some of these classics, and yet I suspect that we are also the sorts of people to resist the colonial influence on our writing. We gravitate more towards like resisting them post-colonial style of literature. So why do you think it is that people like us are so drawn to the classics still?
Well, because, you know, I think of the classics as books that lend themselves to rereadings, you know. So that's why we return to them. It doesn't matter where they're from. You know, it could be even the Mahabharata, for instance. You know, there's something about it that, you know, I think Roy, Arundhati Roy, whom we were speaking about earlier, captures that sense in a way when she talks about is it the Kach Kali dance now? You know, the stories that you already know how they end, but somehow you go back to them. So, you know, just because each time you engage with them, they renew themselves. So that is what I see about these classics that I'm fascinated with. So in that sense, you know, whatever my grievances might be about the socio-political constructions around them almost doesn't matter because of that. And, you know, I also think that they are life forces. So last year, 2021, I was glad to be on the judging panel of the Booker Prize, and, you know, I read a lot of books of contemporary writers, and you know, even being exposed to that large cachet of contemporary writing, it reinforced this idea that going back to the Odyssey, for instance, is something that I think a writer needs to do. It's like, you know, exercise to keep your blood running of some kind, because, you know, you get a lot out of them. I feel like these days, when people ask me, okay, what should I do as a writer to, you know, for my work to be good, strong, or something like that, I often say to people, look, what you should be thinking about is not should my work engage the reader. You know, should I draw people in? Because I feel like those things are relatively easy to do. You know, like if you want to engage the reader, be sensational. You know, somebody is beheaded on the first page of the story. You know, and then we're thrilled. You know, there's blood on the ground. But how do you stay in the mind of readers? It's not often questions that we think about. How is it that 5 days, 1 week, 1 month from now, we're still thinking about your story? Yeah. That is what I think is hard to do, but that is what this classic work of fiction do very well, because these writers, Shakespeare doesn't, for instance, almost never observes. He embodies his characters And that's a difference, I think.
Yeah. One final question about influences, and I promise to move on. I understand that it was Milton's Paradise Lost that in some way influenced your second novel, and I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that happened.
Yeah. So I stumbled on Paradise Lost. I can't remember where. I think it must have been in Cyprus. And I just reading that book, because I've always thought, so Africa is seen as usually a place that is backward in some sense. This is a stereotypical thinking, but you know, partly because, you know, it's a very religious place. People still deal with a lot of what you call quote unquote superstition. But the West, on the other hand, seems to have moved on from most of that. But I've always thought that that is not in fact the case. So cosmologies and beliefs is where institutions arise from. Like, you know, we all talk about democracy and how great democracy is. But what is the provenance of democracy? Where does that idea come? Well, from, in some sense, I mean, if some people will say, okay, let us trace it to the Greeks. But I think that the modern construct of, say, in the US, at least if you read the US Constitution, for instance, it is from the Bible. It's from the cosmological or mythological story of Adam and Eve. You know, the idea that everybody is made in the image of God, and the tree of life and knowledge, eat of this. This is cosmology. I mean, this is mythology, but it is realized in institutions. So the Igbo, you know, tradition, for instance, and cosmologies were not just stories, banal stories that are nonsensical. No, they informed the way in which the people believed, and how even their socio-political structures were constructed. An example is the Chi, which is why I wrote this book. So the belief in the Chi is one of the reasons why in most parts of Igbo land in the east of Nigeria, in pre-colonial times, there was no concept of monarchy or king, of rulership. So you ask, so because they believe that if every individual is ensouled by this divinity, then how can you make the case that by virtue of you being born into a family, then you will become the leader of a particular group, when you're not the same, you're practically the same as other people. So they had an egalitarian structure in which there was a gathering of elders, and that was how decisions were made. So I wanted to, so reading Paradise Lost, and I began to see, you know, okay, this is the source of even liberalism. You know, the idea that we should conquer the earth and keep going and all of that. And I said, okay, you know, if Milton could do this, I appreciated the book anew. Then where are the cosmological novels in the African tradition? And so I wanted to fill that gap, and you know, by writing something around the concept of the Chi. So so that's how I think Milton inspired me to do this work.
The second novel is narrated by a Chi, and the first novel is narrated by a 9-year-old boy. And the kind of vivid imagery that you have, especially of this sort of rambunctious childhood of these boys, is so remarkable. I have to ask, is this autobiographical in some sense? Was this what your childhood was like? I mean, I'm assuming there was no prophecy of fratricide in your childhood.
Hopefully
but
not.
Apart from that.
Yeah. Well, so in some, you know, the fisherman, I think, was partly from my experience as a child. Yeah, but you know, I think what we do as fiction writers is we take lived experience. It could be a shared lived experience, because when the book came out, you know, and I have there in the acknowledgement that this book is for my brothers. And you know, they were asking me, okay, you know, you said you wrote this book, it's dedicated to us, but there's fratricide and, some fighting in the book. So, and then they were asking, okay, where am I in amongst the brothers? And I said to them, look, I can take lived experience and mold it into something that becomes unrecognizable. So it could be your life, but then by the time I finish writing fiction out of it, even you will not be able to recognize your own lived experience. So that is what I think fiction should do. So even if aspects of this come from my own life, it should be unrecognizable to me, is what I'm saying. So I cannot answer your question either way, whether it's autobiographical or not. What I will say is that Akure, the town in which the novel is set, is a character in the novel, and I have tried to depict it as true as it was when I lived in the 90s in it. So the smell, the noise, the river, the ambience, the atmosphere of it, I feel is a living thing, and I try to create that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can actually feel my senses come alive when I'm reading some of the early sections. So it's truly remarkable. So from The Fisherman to an Orchestra of Minorities, what's next? What is Chigozie Obioma working on now?
So I've completed a novel. I have to, I'm glad to say. So it's called The Road to the Country, which is, interestingly, so Jaipur Lit is looking forward into the future. So it's about the Biafran War. It's set around the Biafran War. That was an internecine excessive war that took place in Nigeria between 1967 to 1970. And the premise of the story is simple. So when I write, the gem of an idea comes to me, and sometimes through a conversation, or I stumble upon it often, and then I start to think. I think most of my thought process is spent on how best to tell the story, and that can again make it linger in the mind of people, that they would remember, okay, this is something, because I feel like the novel, so you call it novel, should be novel it should be novel. I mean, it should be new. The canon, the thing about a canon of any kind is when you introduce something into the canon, it expands and it swallows it. Let's say we've never had a novel in verse before, and then one day, a novel in verse comes into the canon. Then now, this is a type of novel that people, so it sets a precedence. So I like to renew the form each time I engage with it. So the premise of this new novel is based on a saying. I don't like to use the word proverb. A philosophy of the Igbo people, that the story of a war cannot be truly told by the living, who is often the people who tell it. It has to be told by both the living and the dead. So this is what I'm presenting to you. So you can do what you will with that. But I think it would be interesting to see how the dead tell stories too.
It sounds amazing. And do you have a title for it yet?
It's called The Road to the Country.
I very much look forward to reading it. Now, Chigozie, you also have the rare honor of having served on a Booker jury yourself. And you have said in an interview, and I'm going to quote, "The experience makes me think, never ever in your wildest imagination even imagine that your book will be in the running for any prize. Don't do that to yourself." And then you go on to say, "It's luck. It's just luck." So tell me, what do you mean by this? What was that experience like?
So reading those books, as I said earlier, gave me, first of all, an appreciation for what my contemporaries are doing, because I believe that the Booker Prize is the biggest Prize for the work of literature. The Nobel Prize is not for one book, it's for a body of work.
Yeah.
And each book, I think, a writer pours their soul and mind and everything in it. So that's the first thing. So as a judge, I've been myself up for the prize before. So, I remember when I was longlisted, how life transforming that was. And then when I made the shortlist, I was very young as well. So going in, I was thinking, okay, I am going to help launch some careers, So that was the first thing. And the books we were reading, at least in the first, so we began reading from December and January. We were swarmed with great works. Just think of any name, big names, people who have won before, Nobel Prize winners and stuff like that, And so reading them alone was a challenge, But at the end of the day, I came to realize that there are several factors that come into play here. One of which is, I think the most important thing is, how can a book stand the test of time? So there were books that I read in January, and we didn't make the last decision on the long list until July. So if you forget about them, then and they don't stay with you, then how can you make a case for them? So that was the thing. So we ended up choosing a selection of 13 books that I felt like, and as well as the rest of the judges, were truly remarkable in the sense that when you reread them, you discover new things. It felt like re-engaging with a place you knew before but hadn't been in a long time. So that's it. So as to the aspect of luck, well, I think to some extent I have to say that talent and I guess hard work must have gone into some of the shaping of the books. But it's also luck because everyone has different taste, and we have to agree. So there were great books that I wanted to be on the list, but that my colleagues were like, no, this is nonsense, don't. So yeah, so in that sense, then you need some luck.
Are you a good disagreeer?
Well, I was happy that we didn't have blood, at any point shared. But yes, it was very intense. I would say, especially at the shortlisting stage. To select the long list wasn't that bad because 13 books. Everybody had their choices in there. But the shortlist and the winner, the shortlist, I think that we fought. In fact, it was very intense. Yeah. So because people really wanted some books to be on there, but we had to come down to only 6 from like the thousands that were eligible for the thing. So it was not easy. Yeah. Which is why it's a privilege to be to have been mentioned on any of these prizes, because I understand what goes into any of that.
Yeah, and that's absolutely amazing. Among other things, though, you also teach. You teach creative writing, and I think that's also kind of life affirming in some ways, because you get to work with the next generation of writers. What is that experience like for you?
Well, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it's very frustrating, because I'll tell you this, for the undergraduates, most of the times what you get is kids who are just thinking, okay, what is the easy course that I can pass? And they see your English. Oh, creative writing, of course I can write. That they take the class. So that can be frustrating. So I have to be frank here. But I think that there's something about when you actually stumbled on work that you feel like has a lot of promise. There's a delight. There's something that happens in your stomach. You're like, that shakes you, yeah. So I have been lucky that a lot of times I've had that experience, and that is good. It is gratifying, and for me in general, I think that it is necessary to be mentored somehow. You should have someone who can often tell you, I think truthfully, look, this is not the path that you should be walking on, and that is how I see my pedagogy or life as a teacher of fiction.
I love that, because as an editor, I so identify, like when you're reading something new and exciting, something happens in my stomach as well, so it's wonderful. So I think we have about 10 minutes for audience questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and a mic will find its way to you. Let's start with the gentleman over there. Yeah.
My question is about your relationship with the medium of your writing, English. Do you feel like Ngugi Thiong'o, that English has to be decolonized by an African writer?
Long story short, no, I don't understand what that means. Why should any language be decolonized? Was the language colonized before? That's a question. But I think what he's saying in that essay, if I remember correctly, is that, so there was a question of how should we write. I think it ties into the question you asked earlier. Now that we have been colonized, we use English and French and whatnot, and Achebe, for instance, was for writing in English, but then writing in English in a way that is contextual to Nigeria and different places in Africa. But for me as a writer, look, I feel like so I did not ask to be born into Nigeria, for instance, and it's just the case that I was born into this construct in which English language is a language of education. I speak two other languages, Yoruba and Igbo, but I don't know that I could read very well, especially in Igbo. So you write in the language that you're most proficient in, and it happens to be English. And how lucky am I, in fact, that because if I was writing in Igbo, I don't think I would be at JLF, if that was all the language I know. So why should I say, okay, I have this gift and then I would drop it for some kind of renegade thing? It doesn't make any sense to me. So I am glad to write in English. What I think one should do, look, as a writer, I think that creating something, there's a life force that is generated. Yeah. There's an energy that you expend. It's as if something in you comes into being. And I don't think that when you are doing that, you have time to think of externalities, like, what kind of language am I using, or audience, or stuff like that. Just create the work that will linger, that will endure, and don't waste your time thinking, am I like dancing to a particular fad, or am I like breaking a rule? None of that matters. At the end of the day, fiction is about, in fact, this ties into what I was talking about earlier about lingering. We embody the word through a sequence of limiting or reducing agents. So a door is a reducing agent. It keeps people away. Jaipur Literary Festival is a reducing agent. It keeps the horde and mass of people away. And a relationship, a marriage is a reducing agent, because you have discriminated against 1 billion people in India to choose just one person. So when you're writing fiction, you're trying to narrow into and reduce until you have a singular image of a character and you embody that character. So think of how that is, how that expends your energy. So I don't have time to think about all of that, is what I'm saying, really.
On that note, though, would you ever translate from the Igbo?
If it happens, yes, but I don't have any, I wouldn't crave, I would be happy that people can read it. I mean, though most Nigerians will rather read English, I would say, than Igbo, but yes, if there are a few people who will access it better in Igbo, yes, sure.
Let's take something from this side. I think there's a gentleman over here.
Hi, Chigozie. It's a great honor listening to you. So, you're one of my favorite authors writing now. So, I've read both of your books, and I think I found that there's a great dominance of African legends and metaphors and folklores and fables that you use while writing novels in much modern way. So, are those fables or folklores or African legends true or part of your imaginations?
Sometimes I engage in what I call mythopoesis, which is that I create some proverbs and philosophies that don't exist. But I try to do them in such a way that you cannot tell whether or not they've been created by me or not. But I think that is a way of me adding to folklore and mythology. So yes, I like to use that, and I feel like there's something to be said for the way in which stories used to be told that I've tried to recreate, especially in an orchestra of minorities. So yes, I do that.
There's another hand right here. Yeah.
So, an insightful conversation. Chigozie, your experience as a Booker Prize judge, you said there are giants competing, such as Nobel Prize winners and previous Booker Prize winners, with emerging new voices. So, how does the judges bypass the bias? Because we have seen recently that most of the shortlisted and long list is composed by debut novels. So, how does the judging panel bypass the bias?
I don't think we cared about any of that. In fact, one of the novels that we got on the long list in 2021, because I didn't read any of the reviews of any of the books. We realized at the time, in fact, it was a Booker Prize director who told us, look, this book has been ignored by it had 0 reviews, absolute 0. It's called An Island. So it was published by one guy who has his publishing this in his bedroom. Like it wasn't even a publisher, basically. And we read this book. I remember reading it at night. I was about to sleep, but I had to just like cross out one book, because I was running out of time. And I picked this book. I was thinking, okay, I will read like 40 or 50 pages, and then I will continue tomorrow morning. And at 1 a.m. I was still reading, and I closed the book and I'm like, my goodness, who is this person? And she published one book, before. So I just I didn't care who the person was really. What is the book saying? So I think it was coincidental, at least for us, that we had, I think, 2 debut authors in there. But there were some names that I recognized, and the books just didn't engage us, and so.
There's a lady right here, please.
Hey, hi, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to our country, India, and it's very nice to be a part of this talk. I did hear you say towards somewhere in the middle, you did say that if you were to tell someone that they'd chosen something they'd like to do, which you thought was, you could do something else, or you could make something more meaningful or more substantial of your life. How do you decide that, look, I think you're going in another direction, and I think that's the direction for you? And if you do know, how do you put it across? Because it's a very sensitive, it's a make or a break situation. Yeah?
Well, I like to say frankly, and I know that is not a good advice, well, at least people might think so, but if you must, you don't have to write, is what I would say. Do something else, be a doctor, then you can make money, you know. Your life probably will be free of disappointments, you know, or do something else. But if you must write, then know that there will be disappointments, because this is a gamble. I think that we stumble into success, which was one of the things I was saying. You cannot wake up and say that I am going to be a successful writer. It just you might never even publish a short story in your entire life, and you can spend your whole existence trying. This is the grim truth. So so be ready for knowing that you will be disappointed, you will be rejected, you know. So which is why I would say play football instead. But if you must write, then you know, you know that you have this love for it, that you're willing to undertake anything, you know. And so that's it. That's what I'll say.
I think that's a great note to wrap it up on. Thank you so much, Chigozie, for this absolutely phenomenal conversation.
Thank you, Chigozie Obioma, as well as Manasi Subramaniam, for this incredible discussion. As a token of our appreciation, please accept these cards from my volunteers.